Hi New Hope, this is Pastor David here. On Monday's devotional, we talked about those who have been wounded or injured in this life. And unfortunately, that's most of us. But I believe God wanted me to refine the conversation to just a few. He wants to talk to those unique few who feel that they have been wounded or injured specifically by God. We talked about how devastating this feeling is when you feel that God Himself was against you and in some way injured you because of His decisions. He didn't intervene, or He did intervene, and you were deeply wounded. This has created in you a clear separation in your relationship. You could have even stopped trusting Him. All those associated with Him you avoid. You almost stop going to church altogether. Maybe you're deep down angry and you're losing your faith. You feel you have a case against God. Well, let's imagine if you could bring your case against God. On Monday, we talked about how Job rightfully responded his case before God, and in the end, he won. We talked about how I handled the greatest wound and injury in my life by drawing closer to God instead of distancing myself. And in the end, I too won. But I can recall I met a guy who had responded wrongfully in his case before God. I was in Australia, in New South Wales, in a town called Wollongong. Interesting name. After preaching a sermon, I went backstage and the pastor came up to me and says, "I want you to talk to this young man. Let me warn you, he's really, really angry." And so I went back into the green room and I sat down, and this guy, he had tears in his eyes. They were bloodshot red, mucus around his lips as if he had been crying for some time. And he told me the story, how he was deeply in love with this young lady. And he was planning to marry her. He was in his early 20s. And as he looked at me, he said, "Pastor David, how can God do this?" And you could tell the anger. There was literally a shudder in his voice with the depth of pain he was feeling. And as I talked to him, I felt I had to defend God because he was angry, so angry at God. So I pointed out 3 universal laws that were at work in the story. As the story goes, his girlfriend, who he was about to marry, were on their way to church Sunday morning. A guy who had been completely drunk on Saturday night had not wanted to drive home that night, so he slept in his car in the parking lot of the pub that he was drinking at. On Sunday morning, he got up thinking that he was okay now to drive home, but yet he was still very, very drunk. He drove through a red light, and at the speeds he was going, he cleaned up the car that was full of a family going to church on Sunday morning. And that was where his girlfriend was killed. Now, I pointed out 3 laws that were at play at that time that weren't God's fault. You see, there are 3 laws. 1, spiritual law. God has a law that governs Him, that He generally doesn't break. And that law is that He will not intervene or usurp or overthrow a person's free will. It was the free will of that drunk guy to get into the car and drive while he was drunk, which broke another law. The other law was moral law. There are things that are right and there are things that are wrong. It was wrong for him to drive drunk. It was wrong for him to speed. It was also wrong for him to drive through a red light. These are all things that he did. God didn't do them, as I pointed out to the young man. But the other law that was broken that day was natural law. It's physics, it's gravity, it's timing, it's speed, it's cause and effect. The car on that wet road driving at those speeds, behind the wheel a drunk person, all those things, they are physical things that happen. Now, yes, God has intervened in the past in natural law. In other words, He made the mechanical wheels of Pharaoh's chariots fall off. But that's very, very few and far between God ever intervenes by changing natural law. So these 3 laws were playing out. And after I talked to him about all of this, he softened up and he realized he was angry at the wrong person. But yet still he had one question, one real question that he wanted answered. And the question was, why didn't God intervene? And some of you are sitting out there today hearing this, and you've got deep wounds, deep pains, and you wonder why God didn't intervene. You're not blaming God for what happened, but you wonder why he didn't intervene. And so the word of the Lord to you today is, understand and know that God is sovereign. That's a huge thing to understand. That's a huge thing to realize. This young man couldn't acknowledge that, but after I explained it to him a little bit, that God knows all things. He's in charge of all things. He's omniscient. He knows all things. He's omnipresent, which means he's everywhere. He has full grasp of everything, past, present, and future. And so when God makes decisions to intervene or not to intervene, you got to trust him. That he loves you, that his timing is perfect, and that he does what he says, and that he is righteous and just. Remember the two things on Monday I talked about? God's throne is established on righteousness and justice, which means he's right in his decisions. Every time he makes a decision, he is absolutely perfectly right. And every time he comes up with a decision, it is absolutely perfectly just. Hosea 6:1 really reveals God's sovereignty. It says, come, let us return to God. He has torn us to pieces, but he will heal us. He has injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. You see, everything in this life is under the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Trust him, run to him today. Respond rightly in this case, and you too will win.